Our speaker today, Rick Hess, couldn't be more timely. I've gotten to know Rick a little bit over the last couple of years, and he is a person who both pushes us to think differently about our work and to overcome some of the barriers, sometimes self-imposed barriers, that we put on ourselves that keep us from doing truly innovative, truly creative, truly innovational kinds of work. He is an author, a teacher, a policy analyst, and he works in K-12 and higher education issues. His books are many. Most recently, those of you who follow me on Twitter know that I've been enamored with his most recent book called CageBusting Leadership. He's also the author of the popular Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up. He's edited a number of books and articles on philanthropy, productivity, the impact of educational research, and No Child Left Behind. He's also an executive editor of Education Next and is on the faculty and has taught at University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown, Rice, and Harvard. He holds a Master of Arts and a PhD in Government and a Master of Education in Teaching and Curriculum from Harvard University. Please join me in extending a warm Missouri welcome to our speaker today, Rick Hess.
Hey, thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. Just got to do the drive out from St. Louis. Had never actually seen, I don't think, much of Missouri outside of the cities before, and it's pretty. It looks a lot like Eastern Shore in Maryland, for those of you who know that part of the country. It was nice. So, you know, came through a lot of tranquility here to goof up your tranquility on a Sunday, so what the heck. It's all good. Like Chris said, my name is Rick Hess. I'm Director of Ed Policy Studies at one of these DC think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute. As such, unlike just about everybody in this room, I don't actually do anything that makes a difference on a day-to-day basis for kids or anybody else, which often raises a question of who the heck I am, who the heck I think I am, to go out and talk to folks about school and system leadership and what it takes to drive improvement in a district or a state. And what I usually wind up saying is, look, let's be incredibly clear about what I can and can't speak to in a useful way. I always tell folks the last possible place that you ought to be offering advice on scope and sequence, on instruction and pedagogy, is from the 10th floor of a DC office building. I'm not out here to tell you guys how to actually tackle instruction, because I don't think I'd have a lot to say on that front. On the other hand, the advantage of actually not having a real job is that I have a lot of opportunity to travel around the country, to meet with folks, to hear from people, and to get a sense of some of the way that issues play out. One of the things that has struck me over the years is that it is enormously difficult for school and system leaders to do the work we want them to do within the constraints imposed by rules and regulations, contracts, and cultures. It has also struck me, however, that these constraints are substantially less severe than we often imagine. That school and system leaders can do much more than they often think they can do. The problem is they don't know what they can do. Nobody has ever encouraged them to do these things, or they are caught up in urban myths that misinform them as to what is or is not possible. That's what I want to talk with you guys about today. And the way to think about this talk is not that I am coming out to tell you things about your schools or your system or about Missouri education that you don't know. One of the curses of my existence is I'm always speaking in every room to everybody who knows more than I do about whatever the subject is at hand. On the other hand, the advantage of not being deeply versed in what's going on in a district or state is that I have the opportunity to look at things from a different perspective, not a better perspective, but it's not a perspective that's devoid of utility. Think about it this way. If you're walking along a trail each and every day, you're walking along that trail and you know every root and every leaf, and you get to know it intimately. But it can get very easy to take that trail for granted. What I offer is a chance to see what the forest looks like from 70,000 feet. It's not a better view. It's not a more accurate view. It's just a different view. Hey, can we get the PowerPoint up? All right, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you about this new book, CageBusting Leadership. It came out with Harvard Education Press back in February. And cage busting starts from a real simple premise. That I've been doing this work, I've been teaching high school or teaching in schools of education or doing policy work now for about a quarter century. And in that time, I have decided that school reform has a patron saint. It's Sisyphus. Those of you in this room, you're an educated room, you know who Sisyphus is. Greek king, had a nasty habit of murdering and robbing from travelers and dignitaries. Gods weren't amused. When he died, they condemned him to Hades. There, his eternal torment was to try to roll the boulder up a mountain. Every time it got halfway up, it would roll back down. Welcome to school reform. Those of you who've been doing this long enough will remember Ron Edmonds and the effective schools research from the 1970s. Before the advent of the U.S. Department of Ed, we spent millions of federal dollars to support Ron and a team of really smart people trying to identify the characteristics of effective schools. They figured them out. It was rocket science, turned out. Strong leadership, formative assessment, collaborative professional cultures. You know, who would have thought it? So now that they had finally cracked the code, we knew what to do. The late 70s and early 80s was the question, how do you implement the effective schools findings in schools that aren't doing well? We cracked the code, we were halfway there, we just needed to get to the top. Turned out nobody had any idea how do you actually get schools that weren't effective to start doing the things that make you effective and make a difference. It rolled back down. So people got frustrated. In the 80s, we came up with new solutions. Block scheduling, site-based management. Early pilot results, enormously promising. Halfway up the mountain, all we needed to do was take these things to scale. When they tried to scale these reforms, nothing changed, except in Chicago, where they did site-based management at 500 schools and found that it turned into a disaster at the worst 170, which was a problem. In the 90s, we tried new stuff. Comprehensive school reform, small high schools. Gates Foundation spent a couple $100 million on small high schools. The initial pilot results at particular sites were fantastic. When you went to scale, it rolled back down the mountain. Now, whenever we talk about these disappointments, we tend to either to say that was the wrong idea, despite the early pilots, and we know better now, or we say it was an implementation problem. Let me put it to you another way. If you're Sisyphus' poor wife, and you're sitting at the base of the mountain watching this guy roll the boulder up, you can absolutely probably offer helpful advice. You can say, honey, you know your hands are too close together. You got to spread the grip a little bit. Told you not to wear sandals when you're rolling a boulder. Get yourself some hiking boots. The advice is probably useful, right? It's probably better to do those things. But it misses the fundamental challenge, which is that you're trying to roll a boulder like up a mountain, which is problematic. Now, in education, of course, we don't say spread your hands or wear hiking boots. We offer other kinds of boulder rolling advice. So when we see that comprehensive school reform and effective schools research have failed to make a difference for persistently low-performing schools, we decide that the real solution is to come up with a new name. So we call it turnarounds. So we're going to do the exact same stuff they failed to do successfully in the 70s and 90s, but now we have an exciting new label for it. Or we suggest, you know, the real problem here is we're not sufficiently differentiating instruction. Now, I used to teach with Carol Tomlinson at University of Virginia. I'm a huge fan of differentiation of instruction, but I got to tell you, When I taught high school in Louisiana, I had 150 kids a day. There was no earthly way I was actually going to differentiate effectively around diagnostics and remediation for those kids. And I don't think I was the worst teacher on my faculty. So it's not that the idea is wrong, it's that implementing it is much harder than saying it. That goes for so much of this stuff. You know what? You will talk to folks at foundations and folks working in districts or at the state level who go, you know what? What we need really to do to drive improvement is we got to use best practices, or we got to use data to drive decisions. Well, I'll tell you what. Nobody back in the 80s or 90s was saying, let's use worst practices. Nobody was saying, you know what, this data we got, let's ignore it. They all thought they were using the best practices they knew and the best data they had at their disposal, and yet it didn't make any difference. If you think that you can run the same playbook, but what's going to be different is now finally, in August 2013, we have or July 2013, we have stumbled upon the right data and the right best practices. I think you're overly optimistic. I think the bigger problem is that all this stuff is good and useful when it comes to rolling the boulder a little better, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is when you're rolling the boulder up a mountain, you're not going to make a lot of progress. You got to roll it on flat ground. What do I mean by this mountain? Let me give you an example. When my friend Michelle Rhee was chancellor in Washington, D.C., she caused a lot of ruckus, right? Michelle's a polarizing personality, which is why this is a fun example. One of Michelle's less polarizing insights was when she became chancellor of D.C. in like 2006, 2007, it took 8 business days for the school district to be able to tell a parent if their child had attended school when they left their house that day. Because teachers would take attendance by putting stickies on Scantrons, hanging it on the door, somebody to come around from the principal's office, collect it, sit in the wire basket on the secretary's desk, till somebody drove around to 120-odd schools, sit in the wire basket till somebody could blah, 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 8 days later. And what's funny is everybody always kind of nods or, shakes their head and goes, that's crazy. And then every time I give this talk, 4 people come up and go, dude, 2013, it still takes us 8 days to tell parents. But, Michelle said, look, we're trying to run these turnaround efforts at some middle schools, and we think it's a real problem if we want parents more engaged if they don't know if their child showed up at school when they left the house that day. What can we do? So she got together her young team of outside-the-box thinkers. One of them had heard of a cool new technological solution. It was called a laptop. And said, hey, why don't we have teachers take attendance on the laptop? It's entered in the system. We can clean it, code it over the firewall. That afternoon, parents can know if their child was in school, if they either have a device or they can go to the library and check. They were going to do this at 3 middle schools. So Michelle's number 2, Kaya Henderson, sat down with the Washington Teachers Union, sat down with the general counsel, and general counsel for the WTU said, yeah, taking attendance is obviously permissible work duty. Here's the challenge. Data entry is an impermissible work duty under the contract. And we think taking attendance on a laptop constitutes data entry. They took 12 weeks. Kaya spent a good chunk of time working through to get an MOU with the Washington Teachers Union to allow them to have teachers take attendance on laptops at 3 schools. The usual interpretation of the story is how evil unions are. I think that actually misses almost the entire point. There's actually 2 interesting things here. One is, I will bet you dollars to donuts that provision was in the DC contract because some knuckle-headed principal or superintendent at some point didn't like a teacher. And so sometime in 1983 or 1993, they assigned a teacher a whole bunch of stacks of forms to hand enter into Excel, and the union grieved it, and it got written into the next contract. So when we blame somebody for these things, often what we're blaming is the failure of leadership to behave responsibly over time. Second thing is how incredibly typical this is. And in a room where that's a little more conducive to it. Sometimes people kind of laugh at that story. This isn't the most laugh-inducing room I ever saw. But I say, look, you know, it's funny that we would laugh at this because you guys know this better than I do. That if you sit down with APs or principals or district officials or SUPs and you start cataloging the number of times that they're doing exactly what Kaya Henderson had to do in that story, hand-holding somebody to get an MOU or get a permission or get a waiver in order to do something that is obviously in the best interest of kids, you quickly run your list into hundreds or thousands. This is part and parcel of what our leaders do every day. In my experience, routinely, folks spend 30, 40, 50% begging for permission to do what they need to do around Title I, Title III, IDEA, board policy, and all the rest. That's the mountain. If you're spending 30% of your time doing that stuff, that means you're working a 75-hour week and you're only getting 50 hours worth of effort. That's your 30% incline. The point of cage busting is that if you can actually reduce that incline, if you can roll that boulder on a flat ground, you still need to use all the techniques to roll the boulder. It's still about best practices, and it's still about differentiation and the rest. But if you can do that in a way that you've got a fighting chance, you just might make a difference. Now, the book's not called Mountain Climbing Leadership or Boulder Rolling for a real simple reason. The mountain is actually a really horrible analogy for what I just discussed. It's a horrible analogy because mountains are natural phenomena. They're just there. Nothing in that story I just told, nothing in supplement not supplant regs, nothing in state certification requirements is a natural phenomena. These are all things that we have written into policy, written into contract, brought into practice over time. What we have done is created bars of a cage. Now, that cage could be a terrific fit for our schools. It's just not. And the reason it's not is because those practices and those provisions and those rules and regulations were written in 1993, in 1973, in 1953. And what we want our schools to do has changed dramatically over time. A century ago, in 1900, 1 American in 10 finished high school. Today, we want the state of Missouri to educate every child in the state to a high level of rigor in a broad swath of subjects. That's only been a goal for 25 years in this country. Nobody has ever imagined in the history of the world that they knew how to do it. Our schools are not designed with that aim in mind. 30 years ago, if you wanted to tutor a child who had challenges, you had really two basic options. One, you could pick up your landline phone at the school, call somebody and have them mentor over their big yellow over the kitchen table AT&T phone, or they could drive to the school. Now, if you live in Western Missouri and you want to get a child tutored in Mandarin or physics, you can get a PhD in Sri Lanka who speaks perfect English, tutoring the kid for $15 an hour, one-on-one on a whiteboard. The tools at our disposal have changed. And third, frankly, the labor market has changed profoundly. In the 1950s, 55% of college-educated women became teachers. Today, it's 14%. In the 1960s, the average American college grad was going to hold 5 jobs by the age of 30. Today, they were going to hold 5 jobs before they retired. Today, they're going to hold 5 jobs by the age of 30. It's not that the conventional school staffing model is a bad model. It's just a model that's not actually suited to the realities of life in America in 2013. You guys know this. When you go and you try to recruit top-shelf college seniors to do a job with the promise that they'll be able to do the same job day in, day out, the same way until 2043, it's not a huge selling point. And yet, when you look at our hiring routines, you look at your HR departments, you look at our contracts, you look at our pension system, these things are all built around the notion that the default professional model ought to be coming in as a 22-year-old and doing this for the next 3 decades. Those are the regularities that are built into our system. They're not well suited for the challenges that you're being asked to address today. Now, one way to think about this is, how do we handle this challenge in other sectors? Say the private sector. The easy answer is that they've got a really good solution for this that we can steal. It's called, they fail and go out of business. The private sector is no better at figuring out how to pivot from one set of rules and regulations from one era to another than our folks in education or anywhere else. If you don't believe me, go check out how Bethlehem Steel is doing, Pan Am, TWA. What happens in the private sector, in for-profits and nonprofits, just like in public schooling, is organizations build a set of routines and contracts and cultures around the era when they come of age. But what happens in much of the world is, as things change, there are room for new entrants to emerge. We allow old providers to fail and go out of business. That's not in important ways how we choose to organize things in education, for reasons good and bad. Instead, what we want is our school systems and our school leaders to take old, existing systems, to take the rules and regulations and remake them on the fly. Look, average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company from birth to death, 50 years. 3/4 of America's biggest companies did not exist in 1965. I'll lay odds that every school district in Missouri either existed 50 years ago or as a result of a consolidation of 2 or more districts that already existed 50 years ago. And if that's the case, that means you've got rules on your books that go to the 1940s, to the 1930s and before. That makes it hard to lead these organizations. And what it means is that if you want to be a successful leader in a public school context, there's actually 2 halves to the equation. One half is the actual stuff of teaching and learning. Dick Elmore's triangle, right? Student and teacher in the presence of curriculum. We all get that, no argument. That's the work that schools are in. But the other half of the equation is, how do you actually do this in hand-me-down organizations and systems? This is the stuff at CageBusting. And this is the stuff that we don't talk about, that we don't train our leaders in, that we don't socialize our leaders to handle, and then we bemoan the fact that our leaders don't seem to drive transformative change. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is from what gets covered in Ed Leadership and Fight Out the Cap'n, the 2 most widely read magazines by educational leaders, from 2009 to 2012, through the teeth of the Great Recession. If you wanted to read about collaboration, professional development, culture, the stuff of instructional leadership, you were good to go. But in the teeth of the Great Recession, if you wanted to learn it all about regulation, about licensure, about contract negotiation, much less about dealing with layoffs, you were pretty much on your own. Same thing shows up when you look at preparation programs for school leaders. As Chris mentioned in the intro, I teach at multiple universities. I teach in the Graduate School of Education, for instance, at University of Pennsylvania, and I've taught there at Harvard and at University of Virginia, and I teach in the business school at Rice University. At Rice University in Texas, we actually got the state to approve it so that principals and superintendents can get their license through the MBA track at the business school. Now, what's interesting is when folks go to Rice, to the business school, aspiring educational leaders sit alongside folks who want to run hospitals and nonprofits and be sleazy energy traders. Yeah, this room really is not conducive to laughter. I've never heard that not going to laugh before. It's okay. You know, what are you going to do? You've got faculty at the business school who teach folks in nonprofits and for-profits and public agencies. They use cases from airlines and from healthcare what we're really talking about is the diversity of experiences and exposure. When you think about really almost all in my experience, the nation's 700-odd ed leadership programs, it's a very different experience. Aspiring leaders sit side by side with other career K-12 educators. They read almost exclusively a canon that consists of Sir Giovanni and Elmore and Boldman and Deal and Hargraves and Leithwood and Foulin. They are taught almost exclusively by career education leadership faculty who only teach people who want to be educational leaders. And as a result, you see things like this. We did a study a couple years back, studied 220-odd courses from a national stratified random sample of 30-odd ed leadership programs. There were about 300 or 400 weeks that focused on personnel management. Of those weeks, 5% had any mention in any way, shape, or form of compensation and termination. The other 95% were almost entirely about culture building, collaboration, constituency buy-in. It's not that these aren't good and important things, but I'll tell you what, they would be really useful things if you were going out to Silicon Valley to start up an education firm on a fresh sheet of paper. Because you got no bars in your cage, you got nothing you got to escape from. If you're trying to go build a culture, get constituency buy-in, improve curriculum instruction in an existing school or school system, you need a lot more attention to the regularities of life, and we don't provide that. Here's an example. This is about a dozen of the most widely assigned books on school leadership. These books all contain multiple chapters on how does one lead a faculty and how does one cultivate personnel. Yet, if you do a word search of each of these books, they never once mention things like union contract or the phrase collective bargaining. So they will tell you ad nauseum how you should manage a faculty if you did not actually have to worry about the constraints imposed by contractual agreements. This is really nice advice if you're leading schools in Fantasyland. Otherwise, it comes up a little short. It's actually worse than that. For folks who go through traditional ed leadership programs or who read the advice they get, not only is the cage busting half of the equation ignored, but cage busting is generally belittled. So many of you in this room are probably familiar with what's worth fighting in your school. Interesting thing to me here is that I have a huge respect for Michael Foulin and Andy Hargraves. I know them some. I think that their work on instructional leadership is terrific. But because they are looking entirely through an instructional leadership lens, they offer advice which I think causes leaders to wind up stuck in the cage. So for instance, they tell leaders that they are a moral failure. They are a moral failure if they try to fire people who are bad at their jobs. The right course is to spend an enormous amount of time and energy trying to get these people to not be bad at their jobs. Well, I'll tell you what. You guys know the 80-20 rule. 80% of the work in any organization is done by 20% of the staff. Sometimes it's easy to forget the 20-80 rule. Leaders in most organizations spend 80% of their time on the least effective 20% of their staff. Principals and superintendents spend 80% of their time cleaning up after that handful of teachers or school leaders who cause a mess, who let things get out of hand, who are ineffective, observing them, writing them up, documenting them. Way to think about this is this. If you've got a struggling school with a faculty of 40 or 50, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that you've probably got something like a half dozen or a dozen teachers in that school who are remarkably ineffective and who may not be deeply troubled by that fact. And you probably got another 40 teachers in that school who are either doing well or trying their hardest. And if you look at how principals wind up spending their time, you will see an enormous amount of that time and energy is spent trying to intervene or clean up after that handful of folks who are not likely to get better and who aren't invested in the school, at the expense of making a difference for those folks who do want to get better and would value the time. Another thing that you see dismissed frequently is the importance of running a tight ship. Well, look, running a tight ship simply means that we are going to pay more attention to how we're using time and money. If we're wasting time and money, it makes it that much harder to get up that mountain because that mountain is that much steeper. So let's talk about that. School and system leaders only have 4 things to work with. This isn't unique to education. This is true of anywhere, anytime. You got tools, talent, time, and money. To the extent that you're using these well, it becomes easier to get a big oomph out of high-quality instruction and use of best practices. To the extent that you're wasting these, it means you need to have that much more charisma. It means your instructional technique needs to be that much better just to make the same stuff happen. Let's do a couple examples just to make sure I'm clear what I'm talking about. Now, the reason this stuff is central to cage busting is, look, cage busting is not an abstract concept. Cage busting is nothing more, it is nothing more than equipping you or your leadership to be the instructional leaders you want to be. The reason that we pay attention to the bars is not because they're interesting in their own right, but because they are stopping us from solving problems for kids. The reason we care about better use of tools, talent, time, money is not because we care about them in their own right, but because with more time, with more talent, with more money, you can serve kids more effectively. You can put the instructional stuff on firmer footing. So, for instance, we hear frequently that we need kids to have more time in school. You're especially likely to hear this in districts that are facing the loss of accreditation or in schools that are flagged as needs of improvement. Well, let's think about this. Average kid in the U.S. has about 6 instructional hours a day. Has a school year of about 180 days. That's about 1,080 instructional hours a year. We also know, going back forever from the Michigan Time Use studies, that the average instructional hour is only about 65 or 70% of it is used for instruction. The rest is used for announcements, attendance taking, discipline, paper passing. You know the routine. Well, think about that. That's about 360 hours a year of instructional time that's not being used for instruction. When we talk about going to legislatures to get the funding to add 2 weeks to the end of an academic year, 6 hours a day, 10 days, that's 60 hours. So if you reclaim 1/6 of the time that the typical school or system is wasting each year, you've actually just added 2 weeks of instruction. And you've done it while actually telling kids and teachers that you value their time and don't intend to waste it. Well, what might one do? Some of you all in this room are probably familiar with Doug Lamav's terrific book, Teach Like a Champion. Sometimes people talk about it as a recipe for great teaching. I think that's wrong. I think what it does is explain you how to put teachers in a position to succeed. One of the things Doug notices in the book is that when you're talking, for instance, it's his example called tight transitions. He mentions in the book that if you actually watch a typical K-5 classroom, typical teacher is passing out about 15 pieces of paper a day. And further, he says, look, if you stopwatch it, typical classroom, it takes about 1.5 to 2 minutes from when the teacher starts passing until the kids are settled down and kind of back learning. He says, look, do the math. That's 25, 30 minutes of lost learning a day, of lost instructional time. Well, if you go to a website, you'll see clips of this. One of the things he found when he was looking at highly effective teachers was that they turned the first day of school into soccer practice as far as passing out paper. They said, look, guys, we're going to keep passing these things back until we get it down to about 15 seconds. And these are kids, right? Elementary school kids enjoy this kind of stuff. So you see it on tape. They just do that. Zip, zip, zip. Teachers time them. Takes half an hour the first day, they get it down. That's a minute and a half, minute and a quarter, minute and a half reclaimed, 15 times a day. That's 25 minutes a day, 5 days a week, that's 2 hours a week. 36, that's 70 hours right there. Now let's be clear. You're going to have slippage, of course, we get that. You're not going to get all 70 of those hours. Let's also be clear that you could get those hours back and make not a lick of difference for kids if you're not doing high quality instruction or you're not paying attention to what you do at that time. But I'll tell you, I'll go into districts, I'll go into schools, kind of ask about use of time. They have no idea. Nobody's monitoring this. This isn't part of what principals are being told to look for instructional rounds. Superintendents are not setting any expectations and not offering any formative support on how to make sure that instructional time is being used wisely. The fact that we are burning 360 hours a year of kids' time is just taken as just part of this is what schools do. And then we show up in the State House asking for more money to extend the school year so we can bore kids for another couple days. Here's another example. We've got a talent model which made a ton of sense if you were Horace Mann in the 1840s trying to build out Massachusetts common schools to hire cheap women teachers to read the King James Bible to Catholic immigrant kids. I'm not at all sure it's optimally configured to educate all children in Missouri to high and rigorous levels. Let me put it this way. I'll walk into struggling schools, ask a K-5 principal, what are you most concerned about? They'll tell me, look, it's ELA. If we don't get ELA right, nothing else matters. Say, all right, hey, let's go look at your best fourth grade reading teacher and your worst fourth grade reading teacher. And you'll walk in, and the best fourth grade reading teacher is teaching reading for 90 minutes to 31 kids. And the worst fourth grade reading teacher is teaching reading for 90 minutes to 31 kids. And they're both doing an hour of math and 30 minutes of CAF duty and 20 minutes of dismissal. I always want to say, hey, let's go across town to pediatric hospital. Let's do it this way. One of your students that you really like is on the operating table. Best pediatric surgeon in the state of Missouri is operating on your student. We get to the 90-minute mark. The surgeon starts stripping off her gloves. You say, hey, doc, what's up? She goes, oh, I did my 90 minutes. It's my turn to go watch the patients eat in the cafeteria. But don't worry, the worst pediatric surgeon in the state of Missouri is going to finish up. You still probably care about evaluation, professional development, all the things we talk about, but this strikes me as a suboptimal allocation of talent. Yeah, we go into struggling schools that say, look, you know, we're having a challenge here. We've got 50 faculty, we've got a dozen or 2 dozen who are weak instructionally. We've only got 7 or 8 who are really terrific at ELA and math. How do we hire more great teachers? First question, it seems to me, ought to be, how do you make sure you're getting the best use out of the teachers you already got? If you got teachers who are terrific with students with particular needs, how do you get them to want to serve more of those students and reward them for doing so? If you got some teachers who are stronger at decoding, or in certain subject areas, or at mentoring their colleagues, why is it just catch as catch can? Why is our approach to this, when we've got those 2 rising second graders who are a real handful, that the principal walks up to their strongest 3rd grade teacher, puts her arm around them and says, Mr. Jones, you know, your reward because you worked so hard this year is I'm going to give you the 2 toughest kids to educate. Down the hallway, Mr. Applebaum, his reward for being a lousy teacher is I'm going to give him the easy kids. Yet these regularities too often just unfold year after year, and then we talk, what can we do at the state level, at the valuation, to fix this? Well, you fix it by starting to make sure you're squeezing all the juice out of the talent you got. Third example is everybody's always telling you they need more money. And we all always need more money. But in CageBusting, I talk about a real simple mantra. I say if it costs more, it's not reform. If it costs more, it's just buying more stuff. And you can buy more stuff and it can be good or it can be bad. But I got to tell you, if you're spending 10% more money and you're doing 10% better, that's not reform. That's not even improvement. That's just not wasting money. Reform is figuring out how to take what you got and use it more thoughtfully. So for example, average teacher in the U.S. is absent about 8 days a year. Average school district across the U.S. spends about $125 a day on subs. That's about $1,000 a year per FTE. That's in addition, of course, to the 8 days of lost learning. 8 times 6, 48 hours. Let's not kid ourselves. We know kids aren't learning, both from personal experience and from the research, during those 48 lost hours. If you got iPads, if you got laptops, first thing to do is ask yourself, what are you doing to have teachers can their lessons the day before if they're going to be absent? So at least kids are able to access the teacher on the day that the teacher's out, rather than just go through the kabuki theater of pretending to learn while a sub's in the classroom. But let's set that aside. You're spending $1,000 a day on FTE just because people aren't showing up to do their job. What are we doing about that? What is your system doing to reward and acknowledge principals whose faculties show up much more often than the norm? What are you doing to create awareness at schools that have high rates of faculty absenteeism? What are you doing to reward school leaders and faculty at schools who get out of bed more mornings to show up and serve their kids well? And what are you doing to actually create consequences for people, even if it's contractually prohibited, who take a couple of mental days off during the year? Because I got to tell you, average American faculty member is not getting sick 8 days a year in the course of 180 working days. They're probably on average, if you look at the data, probably sick maybe 2, 3, 4. In order to get the numbers up that high, there's something else going on. And what are you doing to deal with it? Now, as soon as we start talking this way, which is how we set up the cage-busting conversation, people say, well, that's all interesting. You don't understand. We've got a contract that provides teacher with stipulated number of personal days. And you don't understand. We have job descriptions which determine how we can compensate teachers and how we can assign them in workloads. And you don't understand that we are doing the best we can with the time we have, and there is no way to make the kinds of adjustments you're talking about. Well, first thing to keep in mind is what you think you can do and what you can do are two different things. I was working with a really large school district out west last year. Hundreds of thousands of students. They hadn't been able to run an externship program for more than a decade. Hadn't been able to run it because it turns out, when we sat down to talk about it with the student services director, that state policy required you have an FTE on premises if you have kids in an externship. I said, that's weird. We had somebody call the state to check on it. Sat down the next week to talk about it. Turned out the problem was vastly exaggerated. The district policy had quoted the state policy as saying you needed an FTE on premises to have a kid in an externship placement. When we called the state education agency, turned out what you needed to have was an FTE regularly visit the premises. This kind of getting lost playing telephone from federal regs to state regs to district regs to school level understanding is routine in my experience. So it turned out they could absolutely run the program they had been unable to run for 11 years. All they had to do was have a faculty member do a round of the externship sites on a monthly basis. When told what you cannot do, it is important to first say, well, wait a minute. What problem am I trying to solve for kids? How are we trying to use time, tools, talent, money in a smarter way? And then let's not ask, can I do this? It's important to ask, how can I do this? Because that invites folks into the conversation. With the state, we didn't say, can we do this? We said, how can we? Which calls them to double check the regs, and they were very happy to work with this school district to work it out. But a huge amount of the time, people don't do things they're already perfectly permitted to do. Here's a real simple example. When Dan Weisberg went to run Teacher Performance Unit for Joel Klein in New York City, he came to town One of the things he first heard talking to school leaders was principals were getting driven crazy because they were told that the contract required they have 5 negative evaluations before they could initiate dismissal of a teacher. Well, given their evaluation framework, that meant you had that teacher for at least 1.5 years, 2 years, which meant you had a negative attitude in the teacher's lounge for at least that time. Teachers found it easy to just play Dance with the Lemons. So Dan went, looked at the contract. Turns out it wasn't 5 evaluations to initiate dismissal. It was 1. He tried to figure out what was going on. He knew it was that darn United Federation of Teachers, the union. It wasn't. Turned out it was the attorneys, the general counsels, who worked for the New York City Department of Education. Because what they had found is that when they went into a grievance or arbitration with more documentation, they almost always won. It made their lives easier. It made them look good. And the only consequence was it created a lot more stress and paperwork for principals and made them less willing to actually address ineffective teachers. You find this time after time. Routines and norms and protocols that people will tell you exist may or may not exist. In the book, I talk about big P policy, which is stuff that really is written down in law in black and white, and little p policy, which is stuff that people tell you, or things you think might be policy. And we're not very good at telling the difference. And that's how little, thin, reasonable bars of the cage get supersized into giant inflated bars that make people feel like there's nothing they can do. Not only ask, how can I do this? But also ask folks when they tell you you can't do it, please tell you where it's written down that you can't. For example, Walter Jackson, you guys actually might wrestle with this, especially some of you in these small districts. Walter Jackson had a problem. He was a turnaround principal in Houston Independent School District, was being asked to have his, took over a turnaround school where kids were reading 5, 6, 7 grade levels behind. His faculty were not a match for what he needed to teach. Now, in Houston, I suspect it's a different kind of matching problem than you might find in some of the rural districts. His problem was his high school English teachers were all trained in American Lit and English Lit. When you've got 9th and 10th graders reading at a 3rd grade level, you need teachers trained in decoding, phonemic awareness. He said, look, we could send our high school teachers to 3-day workshops all we wanted. We could run PLCs till we were blue in the face. They didn't have the skills that our kids needed. What he wanted to do was bring elementary teachers up to staff the high school. Problem was, other than, is this a good idea? And Walter thought it was. Problem was, Texas teacher of record requirements require that in order to get credit towards graduation, 9 and 12 students have to be taught by certified 9 to 12 personnel. Nothing you could do. District reached out to the state, explained the problem, asked how can we do this. 4 weeks later, the state issued a waiver. Said, yeah, that makes sense. You're a turnaround school. Let's go ahead and do this. 3 years later, Walter Jackson School had gone from the bottom 15% of high schools in Houston to one of the top 20% of high schools in Houston. It wasn't just this by any means, but I think it was this kind of thinking and problem solving, which we too often take for granted. Now, oftentimes people will say, that's all well and good. That's all well and good, but we can't do it. You don't understand our contract. Ari Rossman, who runs a New Teacher Project, talks in the book about a time where TNTP was brought into a Midwestern city. Superintendent was grumbling about the awful contract they had. TNTP sent its team in. Somebody paid $500,000 for them to go through this stuff line by line, through HR, through board regs. At the end of 3-4 months, they sat down with the soup and said, you know what, good news. You've actually got a pretty reasonable contract here. You've got a ton more freedom than you've ever been using. Turns out all the real problems are the way your HR does business. Principal said thank you. Nothing changed. Next month, he was back on the trail saying it's those son of a guns in the union that won't let me drive improvement. One of the things that we have allowed to happen in this country is we have allowed scapegoating of unions to stand in for setting high expectations for creative and dynamic leadership. Now, I'm tough on the unions, don't get me wrong. Nobody's going to, if you're familiar with my stuff, nobody's going to suggest that I'm in their corner. But it is absolutely imperative that we ask school boards and superintendents and school leaders to figure out how to get things done. And if they say they can't get it done, point specifically to precisely what is stopping them, rather than let this game of scapegoating and blame shifting go on. Here's a simple visual of how this works. Did this study about 5 years ago of the nation's 50 largest collective bargaining agreements. We hear all the time, teacher compensation, teacher assignment, work rules are highly constrained. Well, not entirely. About a third of the provisions in these contracts had more restrictive language than not. Only about 10% had more explicitly flexible language. But the thing that was striking was that well over half of the provisions on things like where teachers could be assigned, role of seniority and class selection, flexibility on stipends, additional steps, well more than half the time, the contract was either silent or had contradictory language. Yet you'll see contradictory language, you'll go into a district, you'll ask the superintendent why they're not doing something they have just told you would be a good idea, and they'll say the contract doesn't let me. And then you say, well, gosh, but if we look at your contract, this other provision would seem to empower you. And the superintendent, a disheartening amount of time, will go, yeah, but it's this other piece that constitutes past practice. No, it's not that simple. Contracts are formal documents. If they don't say what you can or can't do, it's an open question. If they say conflicting things, it's an open question. One of the things that I find happens all the time with school and system leaders is they will tell me they can't do things which they actually are empowered to do. It can be useful to look at what your state does and doesn't allow to be bargained, just to do this. For instance, a couple years ago, I was being told by friends in Baltimore County and Prince George's County, Maryland, at a conference, they were complaining about this, that they weren't able to adjust their school start times. Beginning of the year, because the unions wouldn't sign off. Had somebody out of curiosity go look at what Maryland statute is around school calendar. In Maryland, it is illegal for school districts to negotiate over the school calendar. So these guys were telling me they couldn't do something that they thought was good for kids because their negotiating partner wouldn't let them, except that their contract provision was illegal and they were defaulting to an illegal contract rather than doing what they thought right for kids and what was legally permissible. All they needed to do was write a letter to their union partners saying, guys, we know that this has been in the contract for a number of years. It has been brought to our attention that it is actually contradictory to statute. It puts us in legal jeopardy. We're afraid, you know, as much as we like working with you guys, we can no longer respect that provision. It's that simple. Look, that's actually a broader truth when you think about cage busting. Point about cage busting is, as Chris Barbick, who runs the Tennessee Achievement District, said at the launch event, it's not cage fighting. Here's a simple example. Adrian Manuel was asked to take over one of the worst performing middle schools in New York City by Joel Klein. Young guy, Adrian was like 27 at the time, had no ability to fire most of the teachers, had to work with what he had. He said, all right, what we got is mostly we've got to make our faculty better at what they do. Here's the problem. He didn't actually believe PLCs make a lick of difference, and I think the research is with him. He said, look, 2 45-minute weeks don't actually change practice. If we're going to do this right, we got to do it the way Google, the way 3M actually do professional practice, which is I want my teachers not teaching. I just want them collaborating, looking at data, 1 full day a week for 8, 9 hours a day. Problem was, in order to do this at his middle school, he needed his faculty to get the right coverage to teach 4, 5, 6 periods in a row. Problem was, the New York City contract prohibited that. You could only have teachers teach 3 periods in a row. Adrian didn't just stop. He called in his union steward, explained the problem he was trying to solve, what his idea was. Union steward said, that sounds pretty reasonable, sure. Got together 4 teacher leaders. Adrian bought a day of their time. They built a schedule. They took it to the teachers, with teachers teaching in violation of contract. Teachers almost unanimously approved it. And In New York City, as in a huge number of contracts, the teachers at a school have the authority to waive just about any contract provision they wish with a 70 or 75% vote. So, Axion Academy did this. 4 years later, had gone from one of the 20% worst middle schools in New York City to one of the 15 or 20% highest performing. Again, I don't think it was just because of that. I think it's that kind of mindset around how do you use your tools, your talent, your time, your money, so that you're not just hoping practice will improve, but you're creating the conditions when it can. That's kind of a larger point about cage busting here, is that because Adrian knew what problem he was trying to solve, because he was aware of the contract, because he was aware of the possibilities, he didn't burn up his energy and political capital fighting. He was able to use it for problem solving. That's what we call getting on level ground. Now, when we talk about the kinds of reforms that you guys are tackling here in Missouri and folks across the country, teacher evaluation, turnarounds, implementation of the Common Core, I got to tell you, a half century of recent history leaves me really pessimistic that these things are going to pay off the way we'd like them to if we just keep trying to use the same techniques, the same mindset, the same strategies, and just hope somehow that these things are going to save our bacon. In Tennessee and Florida, they spent millions of bucks on teacher eval systems. They spent tens of thousands of hours in Danielson and Marzano observational protocols, and they went from 99% of teachers rated effective all the way down to 98%. New systems don't solve problems. People solve problems. But people are only going to solve problems if you give them the tools, the time, the money, the energy, the mindset with which to solve them. 2 last notes, and then let's turn you guys loose. And you all got a treat. Ron Ferguson's with you, who's a stud. And I think you'll have a lot of fun with Ron. 1, cage busting is not something you do instead of instructional leadership. It is not some new management theory. It is nothing more than a mindset in which you say, I am going to go ahead and solve problems for kids, not within these little narrow boundaries that I'm used to, but taking advantage of all of the tools, the talent, the time, the money that might be at my disposal. Doing this well is not about exhausting yourself. Most school and system leaders I know have already exhausted themselves, and the kids still aren't where they want them to be. And it's not about being a martyr. Here's a quick example. Kaya Henderson, then we'll have one more last slide after this, but it's kind of a nice counterpoint story. I started with DC. Kaya Henderson took over DC after Michelle Rhee left. Kaya wanted to give her principals a big raise 2 years ago, wanted to give them about $35,000 pay raises, went to the administrative bargaining unit, said, hey guys, here's what I want to do. They said, well, we'd love the money, but here's the deal. You can only give that raise if you also give it to all school-based administrative staff. Kaya said, look, we've got school business officers with community college degrees making 70 grand. I can't justify giving them raises. They were at an impasse. Kaya went and looked at the contract because she had learned to do this. Contract gives the DC chancellor the authority to give up to a $20,000 retention raise to any school leader in danger of being poached. Kaya said, I got 121 leaders, I guess, in danger of being poached. Went back to the administrative bargaining unit, said, guys, you got 3 choices. You could sit on your hands and let me give your members a raise and take all the credit. You can let me give your members a raise and then try to sue to stop me from giving them a raise, which is probably suboptimal from your point of view. Or you can go up to the microphone with me and take credit and brag about it. What cage busting does, by knowing the rules, by figuring out the problem you want to solve, by understanding how to make these things happen, it actually builds your political capital because it lets leaders take full advantage of those federal provisions, of those state laws, of those contracts, which they're already allowed to take advantage of, but too often don't know. The key person in helping you do this is an attorney, either your general counsel in your system, or if you don't have one, or if they're not this kind of lawyer, in too many cases they're not. Remember, average attorney in the U.S. is supposed to do 150 hours of pro bono work a year if they're at a firm. Average attorney does 40 to 50 hours. Network with the local legal community to provide you assistance on figuring out what you can and can't do. Last and final point, Nothing I'm talking about is about innovation. It's not about innovation. I suspect none of you guys goes in to buy a car to your family and says, what's the most innovative automobile you got there, Sarah? You say, look, I'd like to buy a car which gets 40 miles to the gallon. Or I'd like to buy a car that's going to be really safe for my kids. Or I'd like to buy a car with Sirius radio. Now, to get to 40 miles a gallon or to make that car safer, people innovated along the way. But we shouldn't worry about the innovation. We shouldn't even talk about it. What we should worry about is solving problems for kids. And if you're focused on that, you're going to wind up accidentally innovating, but it is a huge and persistent problem that anything different starts to sound exciting, and we lose focus on identifying problems, solving them, and figuring out how the heck do we get out of the cage to make them happen. Hey, it's been great to be with you. Thank you so much.